In just 2 minutes of live television, Donald Trump tried to claim the entire U.S. economy as his own triumph, his voice dripping with arrogance under the blinding studio lights. Across 50 states, millions of Americans froze in anger, disbelief, and raw memory of the 2008 collapse they had survived. And when Barack Obama finally broke his silence with one devastating line, the nation gasped. But whose version of history will we choose to believe? In the next few seconds, you will witness the truth that they never wanted the public to know. The studio glowed in shades of blue, a manufactured calm meant to steady millions of restless eyes watching from couches, bars, and late-night airport lounges. Cameras whirred softly, their red lights blinking like unblinking eyes, capturing every twitch, every smirk. For a brief moment, it felt routine. Another primetime interview, another politician eager to bend the spotlight. Then Trump leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his hands folding with the swagger of a man who knew the world was listening. His lips curled into that signature half smile before he declared, "No one's ever fixed this economy like I have. Everything you see right now, it's because of me." The words dropped like a grenade in the quiet studio. The host blinked, shuffling his papers, unsure whether to push back or let the boast hang in the air. Beyond the cameras, silence fell across living rooms. In Toledo, Ohio, a sports bar erupted into murmurs as union workers stared up at the mounted TV. Rick Donnelly, a tall man with calloused hands from years of factory shifts, muttered into his beer, "That's not how I remember it." His buddy leaned closer, lowering his voice as if speaking the truth too loudly might start a fight. In Phoenix, Arizona, Martha Reynolds sat frozen on her couch, knitting needles suspended midair. She had lived through the 2008 crash, watched her pension shrink, and spent nights awake wondering if she could keep her house. The television's glow flickered against her lined face as she whispered to no one in particular, "That's not fair. That's just not true." The split screen of America came alive in real time. On one side of the divide, proud nods and clenched fists as supporters whispered agreement with every word Trump spoke. On the other, jaws tightened, brows furrowed, and voices cracked with disbelief as memories collided violently with his narrative. A college dorm in Philadelphia buzzed with confusion, some students cheering, others throwing their hands up in frustration. A father on FaceTime with his daughter, a Korean War veteran, sighed into the camera, "Don't expect Obama to answer back. He doesn't do that anymore." Inside the studio, the host finally gathered the nerve to speak. His voice was careful, cautious, almost apologetic. Some economists say that many of these gains began years earlier during the Obama administration. The tension spiked like a blade slicing through silence. Trump dismissed it with a flick of his hand, smiling as if the challenge wasn't worth finishing. "They always say that, but everyone knows nothing worked until I came in. Obama had his chance. He failed. I succeeded." In bars, homes, and classrooms across the nation, people sat back in disbelief. The calm of the studio lights had given way to a storm far bigger than the cameras could contain. The question lingered thick and heavy in the air when truth collides with memory on live television. Which one does America believe? The words "Obama had his chance. He failed. I succeeded" still hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot, and outside the glowing studio, America was already splitting in two. In the sports bar in Toledo, Rick Donnelly's voice carried heavier, now his knuckles whitening around the bottle in his hand. "That's not how I remember it," he muttered again, louder this time, the edge of anger creeping into his tone. His friend leaned forward, eyes darting toward the screen, as though Trump himself might hear the challenge, and whispered, "Careful, Rick. Say that too loud in here, and you'll start a fight." The hum of conversation flickered in and out across the bar like faulty electricity. Some men nodded with conviction, clinking glasses to Trump's words, while others folded their arms, lips pressed tight, their silence more dangerous than any shout. The television sound echoed through the wooden walls, each word like a drum beat in a room where every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. No one wanted to be the first to break, but every soul there was bracing for the argument that could ignite. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, Martha Reynolds sat in her living room, bathed in the soft glow of the TV, her knitting needles frozen mid-stitch. The ball of yarn rolled slowly onto the carpet as her hands trembled. The memories of 2008 clawed back with brutal clarity, Nights counting pennies, prayers whispered into the dark, the icy grip of fear that she might lose everything. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "That's not fair. That's just not true." She wasn't speaking to anyone yet. In that moment, it felt as if millions of Americans were whispering the same words into the silence of their homes. In Philadelphia, the chaos unfolded differently. A dorm room crammed with students erupted into a noisy clash. One side jeered at the screen, chanting Trump's name as if it were a sports game. The other side shouted back, hurling facts, frustrations, and fragments of their families' stories. Phones buzzed, Twitter feeds lit up, and hashtags began to bleed into the conversation, amplifying every breath into a war cry. Yet beneath the yelling, there was an unmistakable undercurrent, a collective unease, the terrifying realization that memory itself was now under attack. Back in the studio, the host felt the weight of it all pressing down. His pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out the quiet shuffle of his cue cards. He glanced at Trump, then at the millions of invisible eyes staring through their screens, waiting for him to say something, anything. Finally, his voice cut through the silence, careful and cautious, like a man defusing a bomb. Some economists say that many of these gains began years earlier during the Obama administration. The pause that followed was unbearable. It stretched across living rooms, bars, and dormitories, a silence so sharp it could draw blood. For a flicker of a second, America leaned forward, breath caught in its throat, waiting to see if the narrative would break. Trump smiled, waved the suggestion away like smoke, and dismissed it with ease. They always say that. But everyone knows nothing worked until I came in. And just like that, the air cracked again, half the nation cheering, half recoiling, every household caught in the tremor. The calm veneer of the studio had shattered, and what remained was raw electric tension. The interviewer's hesitation still lingered, a question unfinished, but the damage was already done. The nation was no longer just watching a broadcast. It was holding its breath, waiting to see if truth itself could survive. The dismissal left hanging in the studio did not stay there. It bled outward, racing across airwaves and seeping into every corner of American life. Within minutes, Twitter erupted like a battlefield at midnight, hashtags firing back and forth with the speed of bullets. Hashtag Thanks Obama clashing violently with hashtag Trump economy. Each tweet was a spark igniting thousands more, and soon the platform felt less like a conversation and more like a war zone. Timelines shredded into rival camps where truth bent under the weight of repetition. What had been a single boast in front of cameras was now a storm, raging in real time, impossible to contain. On college campuses, the fallout felt immediate and visceral. In Philadelphia, the dorms still buzzing from the interview now drowned in arguments that spilled into hallways. One sophomore, his voice trembling with disbelief, shouted into his phone, "My dad got his job back in 2012. That wasn't Trump." Across the room, a girl fired back, face red with conviction. "But my uncle swears his business only boomed after 2017. The clash wasn't just words. It was memory itself being pulled apart, one generation's truth colliding head-on with another's." In Des Moines, Iowa, a diner at dawn became a front line. Truck drivers slammed newspapers on counters, pointing at bold headlines as steam rose from mugs of coffee. Trump's right one barked, "My business didn't bounce back until he got in." Beside him, an older man shook his head slowly, glasses sliding down his nose. "Without the bailouts, you'd still be hauling empty trailers," he said, his tone cutting like steel. For a moment, the clatter of plates fell silent, every customer suspended in that fragile space where disagreement teeters on the edge of confrontation. And then there were the veterans. In a VFW hall outside Cleveland, gray-haired men who had worn the uniform found themselves divided. One slammed his fist against the table, swearing that Obama had saved his pension when no one else would. Another shot back with equal fire, claiming Trump's policies gave his grandchildren a future. The argument swelled, each man reliving not just politics but the scars of survival. It wasn't an abstract debate. It was a fight over who had protected their families when the world nearly collapsed. The emotional crescendo rose highest in living rooms where silence said more than shouting. Retirees like Martha Reynolds sat staring at flickering screens, their whispers of "that's not true" swallowed by the noise online. Students sat with earbuds dangling, scrolling through threads that seemed to rewrite their parents' history before their eyes. Everywhere from bars to classrooms to factory floors, People felt the same unsettling chill. The past was no longer safe, it was malleable, reshaped second by second under the glare of digital fire. By midnight, the country's pulse was racing faster than the hashtags that trended across every feed. Hashtag Thanks Obama and hashtag Trump Economy were not just words, they were battle flags planted in American memory. Families argued until voices cracked, friends blocked each other online, and strangers shouted in public as if the debate were life or death. The sense was undeniable. History itself was on trial, its verdict uncertain. And as the night deepened, one haunting question loomed over every screen, every kitchen table, every restless thought. When two versions of history collide, who decides which one survives? The fight over credit reawakened memories many Americans wanted to forget. Trump's boast and Obama's quiet rebuttal did more than spark arguments. It dragged the nation back into the darkest nights of 2008, when the ground beneath ordinary families gave way without warning. For those who lived it, the flashbacks came fast and brutal. Empty homes, with foreclosure signs nailed like scarlet letters, banks crumbling in a single weekend, jobless lines stretching down city blocks in the freezing cold. It wasn't history to them, it was a scar that still throbbed when touched. In Detroit, a truck driver named Harold Jennings remembered the exact morning his company shut its doors. He had been hauling auto parts for nearly 20 years when the call came over the radio park. "Your rig don't come back, we're done." He drove home in silence, staring at the cracked windshield as if it held the answers. His daughter found him sitting in the kitchen hours later, still in his uniform, his hands shaking too hard to hold his coffee. "I thought I'd never drive again," he recalled, voice heavy. "Thought I'd never be worth anything to my family." A crosstown factory worker, Maria Lopez, relived the day the machines went quiet. The deafening clang of steel presses, the sound that had filled her days for over a decade, ended with a single announcement from a supervisor too nervous to meet their eyes. Paychecks were frozen, health insurance gone, and workers poured into the parking lot like ghosts drifting out of a burned building. Maria remembered clutching her son's hand that night, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We'll be okay," she told him, though her chest felt hollow with fear. Farther south, in a small Texas town, high school teacher David Monroe recalled the humiliation of standing in line at a food bank. His classroom had once been full of laughter, but budget cuts slashed his hours until his mortgage drowned him. He described how the line moved slowly, people clutching paper bags as if they were life preservers. He saw former students' parents standing with him, their eyes downcast, their pride shattered. "We weren't lazy," he said bitterly. "We were sinking, and no one was throwing a rope." The memories weren't just stories, they were visceral images burned into the collective conscience. Entire neighborhoods went dark as families abandoned homes, weeds sprouting through driveways where kids once played basketball. Grocery stores closed their shelves, stripped bare. Gas stations boarded up their pumps, wrapped in yellow tape. In city after city, the sound of collapse wasn't thunderous. It was quiet, suffocating, like air being drained from a room. And yet out of the rubble came glimmers of resilience. Harold eventually found work again when federal bailouts kept the auto industry alive. Maria's factory reopened under new ownership, wages slimmer, but survival intact. David held on to his classroom thanks to emergency education funds, his students returning one by one. Each survival was fragile, but each survival was also a testament. For every story of loss, there was a stubborn refusal to give up, even when the system itself seemed to be crumbling. As America watched Trump dismiss the past as failure, these memories surged like floodwaters breaking through a dam. People did not argue with charts or numbers, they argued with scars. They remembered the silence of empty streets, the weight of foreclosure, notices the shame of needing help just to feed their children. And now, hearing the credit claimed so casually, they felt that silence threatened again. The collapse of 2008 was not a chapter they could turn away from. It was a wound reopened by a single boast, and for millions of Americans, the pain was fresh enough to taste in their mouths. The fight over who fixed the economy was not just political theater, it was a battle over memory itself, and memory was something they refused to surrender. Out of the wreckage of collapse came something few expected: lifelines. They weren't perfect, they weren't immediate, but for millions of Americans, the bailouts and federal relief were the thin ropes thrown to people already sinking beneath the waves. And as Trump's voice thundered years later claiming no one had saved the economy before him, those who had clutched those ropes remembered vividly who had tied the knots. Gratitude and anger surged together like two storms colliding over the same sky. In Cleveland, small business owner Frank D'Angelo remembered the morning he almost locked his doors for good. His diner family run, since his father immigrated, had survived recessions before, but 2008 broke him. Customers vanished, credit froze, and the smell of bacon and coffee that once welcomed the neighborhood was about to die out. Then a loan program kicked in, bridging him just long enough to reopen his booths and hire back 2 waitresses. It wasn't magic, Frank growled, wiping the counter with a rag. It was policy. Without it, I'd be another boarded-up window on this street. Pensioner Harold Jennings, who had once feared his trucking days were behind him, still carried the letter from his union in his wallet. The bailouts combined with federal pension protections had salvaged part of what he thought was lost forever. He kept it folded in crease, pulling it out at kitchen tables whenever someone argued that nothing worked until Trump. His eyes would harden as he slapped it down on the wood. "This piece of paper kept my family fed," he'd say. "Don't you dare tell me it was worthless." In Detroit, Maria Lopez's factory reopening wasn't just survival, it was resurrection. The new ownership brought smaller checks, yes, but also a chance to walk back into a building she thought would be her tomb. She remembered the hum of the machines restarting, the way her co-workers cried and hugged each other when the first shift was called. Years later, when she heard Trump brag about being the savior of industry, she clenched her fists. "We were breathing again before he ever stepped in the room," she told her son. Teachers, too, carried memories of a system pulled back from the brink. David Monroe's school lights had almost gone out permanently until federal emergency funds kept the district alive. He could still see the faces of his students on that first day back, the way they laughed nervously in hallways, relieved that their community hadn't been swallowed whole. To David, the rescue wasn't a line on a chart, it was the difference between classrooms filled with hope and neighborhoods swallowed by silence. But memory collided with narrative, like steel against steel. Trump's claim that nothing worked until I came in wasn't just an exaggeration. It was an erasure, an insult to those who had lived the terror and the fragile salvation. For every business saved every pension, preserved every factory reborn, there was a story etched into the bones of Americans who knew the truth. Gratitude for survival coiled with fury at how easily it was dismissed. The nation's pulse throbbed with contradiction, relief for what was endured, rage for what was forgotten. In that collision, one fact stood unshakable. Survival was not given by arrogance on a stage, it was carved out of policy, sacrifice, and grit. And millions of Americans who had held those lifelines would not let their memories be stolen without a fight. The gratitude and anger that pulsed through survivors of 2008 didn't remain confined to memories. It spilled into kitchens, diners, and living rooms across America, tearing at the seams of families. What had once been a boast on a television stage was now a war at dinner tables, forks clinking nervously against plates as voices rose. Parents who had lived the collapse argued with children who only remembered the rebound, and every sentence carried the weight of wounds that refused to heal. The storm wasn't in Washington anymore. It was inside the walls of ordinary homes. In Columbus, Ohio, a father spread mortgage letters across the table, like battlefield maps pointing at the red stamps of overdue payments from 2009. This is how close we came to losing everything. He barked his knuckles, rapping the paper with each word. His teenage son leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone, shaking his head. "Dad, that was years ago." Everyone says the real growth started after Trump. Maybe you're just stuck in the past. The silence that followed was more dangerous than the shouting, the kind that fractured trust. In Birmingham, Alabama, a mother stirred a pot of stew while her husband and daughter clashed in the next room. The husband shouted at the television, replaying Trump's speech, claiming his business didn't recover until 2017. The daughter slammed her textbook shut, yelling back that her scholarship came from federal programs started long before. The mother gripped the spoon so tightly her hand ached, wishing she could silence both voices, but knowing deep down the argument wasn't about politics, it was about who deserved to be remembered as the savior in their story. Generational lines cut deep. Older Americans who had stood in jobless lines remembered humiliation and fear, while their children raised in the shadow of recovery believed prosperity had simply appeared when Trump walked in. The trauma of one clashed violently with the narrative of the other, and neither side yielded. Every accusation felt like betrayal, every counter-argument like erasure. It was less a debate and more a fight for ownership of memory itself. The emotional crescendo swelled in living rooms, where televisions glowed like campfires, drawing everyone closer, only to burn them apart. Friends stopped answering each other's calls, siblings blocked each other on Facebook, and Sunday dinners became battlegrounds instead of reunions. For many, the political storm was no longer about numbers on a chart, it was about scars, pride, and the ache of being told your suffering didn't count. By nightfall, the divide stretched taut across the nation, a cable threatening to snap under pressure. In one home, a daughter whispered through tears, "I know what I saw, Dad. I know what we lived." In another, a grandfather's voice cracked as he told his grandson, "Without those bailouts, we would have been gone. Don't let them erase it." The storm wasn't slowing, it was accelerating, pulling families deeper into the vortex of disbelief and resentment. And as plates cooled on tables and televisions droned on, one haunting question lingered over every fractured conversation, every slammed door, every tear wiped away in silence. Do we ever escape the weight of the crises we've lived through? The man who avoided the spotlight for years finally stepped back in. As the nation tore itself apart over who deserved credit for survival, Barack Obama sat in a quiet Washington office, the hum of the city outside muffled by drawn curtains. The arguments that had spilled into homes and classrooms had reached his ears clips. Replayed headlines, twisted voices raised, until truth itself seemed like a fading echo. For days he had stayed silent, watching as chaos built like a storm he once thought he'd left behind. His aides crowded around the table, faces tense, papers scattered like debris from a battle. One leaned forward, voice low but urgent. "Sir, let it go. Engaging now will only fuel the fire. You've been out of this for years. Don't step into his arena." Another added quickly, "You know what kind of storm this will cause. He'll hit back harder, louder, dirtier. It could drag everything down again." Their words carried fear not just for him, but for the country teetering on a knife's edge. Obama listened, hands folded, gaze steady, his silence heavier than their warnings. He knew the risk they all did. Every statement, every word from his mouth would be dissected, weaponized, turned into another headline in a war of noise. But beneath their caution, he felt something greater pressing on him, an unease that gnawed at his core. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about memory, about whether the story of survival would be twisted beyond recognition. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, as if focusing on something distant, something larger than the room itself. For a long moment, the aides thought he might let it pass again, that he would simply breathe it away, like all the other provocations that had come before. Then his voice broke the silence, low, measured, but carrying the weight of defiance. "If history is being rewritten," he whispered, each word deliberate, "someone has to set the record straight." The room froze. Papers, stilled breaths caught, and even the faint ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder in that instant. It wasn't a roar, it wasn't anger, it was resolve sharpened and quiet, the kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. His aides exchanged uneasy glances, knowing they had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Outside, Washington carried on, oblivious to the decision unfolding behind closed doors. Cars honked in traffic, tourists snapped photos of monuments, news anchors rehearsed their nightly scripts. But inside that room, the air shifted. A former president, who had once walked away from the spotlight, was stepping back toward it, not with bluster, but with precision. The anticipation hung like static before a storm. The nation didn't yet know what words he would choose or how they would land, but in that single whisper, the course had been set. Obama had decided to speak, and the quiet defiance in his voice promised that when he did, America would stop to listen. When the words finally came, they landed not with fury, but with precision, sharp enough to cut through the roar of the moment. Obama's voice, calm and deliberate, poured across the nation in a simple broadcast. No rally, no stage, no cheering crowd, just a steady cadence that felt almost surgical. Facts matter. Leadership is not about claiming credit for what you inherited. The contrast was staggering. Where Trump had thundered, jabbed, and dismissed with a wave of his hand, Obama spoke as if weighing each syllable on a scale. His tone was measured, almost quiet, yet it carried the weight of authority that silence had only sharpened over years. For those who had doubted he would ever respond, the shock was electric. Millions leaned forward on couches in diners at bus stops, as though a voice they thought lost to history had been summoned back. In a grocery store in Milwaukee, a woman dropped her shopping basket when she heard the words spill from the radio overhead. In a high school classroom in Atlanta, students paused mid-lesson, their teacher fumbling for the remote to turn the volume up. In a living room in Phoenix, Martha Reynolds, the retired teacher who had whispered, "That's not true," clutched her chest, whispering now with relief, "He said it. He finally said it." The collective gasp of recognition was not about politics, it was about memory being defended in real time. The line struck like lightning because it did not accuse, it did not rage, it did not boast. It reminded. Obama spoke of the long nights of 2008 when banks collapsed, of the bailouts that kept families afloat, of the reforms that rebuilt a system from ashes. His words carried the rhythm of someone who had lived through it alongside the nation, who had felt the same fear pressing on his shoulders. In his calmness, there was defiance. In his restraint, there was strength. Newsrooms scrambled to capture the moment. CNN replayed the statement on loop, panelists talking over one another in disbelief. MSNBC anchors called it a bombshell cloaked in calm. Even Fox, reluctant to linger, could not ignore the sudden reappearance of the man they had assumed would remain silent. On Twitter, hashtags detonated once more. Hashtag FaxMatter rose, alongside hashtag Obama returns, each clip racking up millions of views within hours. But the most powerful reaction wasn't digital, it was human. A grandmother in Miami pointed at the television and told her granddaughter, "That's how you speak when you want people to listen." A veteran in Chicago turned to his son and muttered, "That man saved my pension." Strangers across the country looked up from their screens, their conversations halting mid-sentence, as if time itself had paused to make room for the words. The emotional peak was undeniable. After years of silence, Obama's return felt less like a political move and more like a reckoning. He hadn't shouted yet, his calm voice roared louder than any rally. And in that fragile stillness, after his words, America found itself stunned, realizing it had just witnessed the quiet return of a heavyweight stepping back into the ring. The words had barely left his mouth before the media scrambled, like fire alarms had gone off in every newsroom. CNN cut to breaking coverage, the anchor staring into the camera, with the intensity of someone who knew the country was holding its breath. MSNBC replayed the clip again and again, dissecting every pause, every syllable like surgeons over a beating heart. Even Fox, reluctant and cautious, could not ignore it. The calm declaration replayed on split screens, beside Trump's fiery rant, the contrast sharper than any editorial could craft. On social media, the explosion came fast and furious. Hashtag FaxMatter trended within minutes, battling against a new wave of hashtag Obama spin. The digital battlefield roared, with memes, arguments, and statistics hurled like weapons. Yet beneath the noise, a current began to form. Quieter but undeniable people weren't just sharing his words, they were whispering them. Unlike Trump's bombastic claims that demanded cheers or boos, Obama's calmness seeped into the cracks of conversation, like smoke, impossible to pin down, impossible to ignore. In a diner in Des Moines, waitresses paused mid-shift to listen to the radio replay. A customer at the counter muttered, "That's it. That's the truth right there," as if speaking to himself, his coffee untouched. In a classroom in Philadelphia, a teacher replayed the clip for her students, the words echoing against whiteboards and hushed desks. A boy in the back raised his hand slowly and said, "He sounds different, like he doesn't care about winning, just about telling us what happened." The class fell into silence, as though the voice had reached them beyond politics. The whispers multiplied. In living rooms, grandparents repeated the line to grandchildren who had never known the fear of 2008. In union halls, men who had once clashed over loyalty to party now nodded in unison, remembering not rhetoric but survival. In jazz clubs, in coffee shops, in whispered phone calls late at night, the phrase became a refrain: FaxMatter. The words were not shouted yet, they carried weight like stones dropped into still water, their ripples spreading outward with unstoppable force. The emotional climax crested in the smallest of spaces, where people least expected to be moved. A mother in Houston turned off the stove, staring at the screen as if the calm cadence had frozen time. A veteran in Cleveland leaned back in his chair, eyes misting, whispering, "Finally someone said it." A college student in Boston typed the phrase into her group chat without explanation, watching as friends replied one by one, "Yes, yes, that's it." America had not expected the return of this voice, and when it came, it was not thunderous, it was steady, deliberate, haunting. Against the bluster and shouting that had dominated for years, Obama's calm sounded almost alien, almost fragile. Yet in its quietness, it struck harder than any roar. And as the echoes rolled through classrooms, diners, and homes, the nation found itself facing a question it had not asked in years. Can a calm voice cut deeper than 1,000 shouts? The Rose Garden became a battlefield of words. Long before the cameras were set, long before the reporters lined up in neat rows under the sharp summer sun, Donald Trump was already pacing inside the West Wing like a caged animal. The calm voice of Obama still echoed across the nation, repeated on every network, dissected in classrooms, whispered in diners. Trump heard it everywhere, even in the silence of his own thoughts, and the weight of it pressed on him like a stone he could not lift. His advisors knew the danger before he opened his mouth. They crowded around him in the Oval Office, papers in hand, voices overlapping in a desperate chorus. "Sir, don't give him oxygen. The calmer he sounds, the angrier you'll look," one urged. Another leaned forward, eyes sharp with fear. "This is a trap. If you hit back, it will only amplify him. Let it fade." Their warnings fell like raindrops on steel. Trump wasn't listening. His jaw clenched tighter with every mention of Obama's words, his hands curling into fists that drummed restlessly on the desk. He turned away from them, stalking the room, his reflection flashing in the tall windows like a specter shadowing his every step. "They think he's a saint," he muttered, voice low but venomous. "They think he saved them, but I'm the one who made this country rich again. I'm the one who fixed it." His advisors exchanged uneasy glances, knowing the tide was rising. Knowing there was no wall high enough to hold back what was coming. The pacing grew faster, his breathing sharper, the silence between his words stretching into something dangerous. He stopped suddenly, spinning on his heel, pointing at one aide who dared to speak again. "You don't get it," he snapped. "He doesn't get to rewrite my story. Not while I'm still here." The aide fell silent, shoulders stiff, because they all knew what followed. When Trump's pride was pierced, retaliation was never a question, it was inevitability. Outside, the press pool gathered under the heavy air, the smell of cut grass mixing with anticipation. Reporters checked their phones, eyes darting at every movement of staffers carrying folders between offices. They could sense the storm before it broke the way. The White House seemed to hum with restless energy. Everyone whispered the same thing Trump was going to answer. Inside, his advisors tried one last time. "Sir, this isn't the moment. If you come out angry, it will be his calm against your chaos. That's the split screen America will see." Trump stared at them, eyes narrowing, then smirked with the defiance of a man who believed volume alone could bend reality. He straightened his tie, slammed a hand against the desk, and declared, "Set it up. The Rose Garden. Today." The decision fell like a gavel striking wood. Advisors groaned, some burying their faces in their hands, others rushing to make the necessary calls. Staffers scurried down hallways, heels clicking like drum beats of a march toward battle. In less than an hour, the stage would be set outside, rows of chairs, microphones, ready, cameras aimed at the podium, where Trump would step out. The anticipation was unbearable. Across the country, televisions flickered to life again. News tickers flashing, president to respond in Rose Garden remarks. Families leaned forward, bars filled with murmurs. Reporters sharpened their pens. Everyone knew what was about to happen even before the first word was spoken. Trump had decided. The calm that had gripped the nation was about to be shattered. The Rose Garden would not be a stage of diplomacy that day. It would be a battlefield, and the explosion was only moments away. The sun beat down on the Rose Garden, but the heat radiating from Donald Trump burned hotter than the weather itself. He strode to the podium with the swagger of a man ready for war, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. Reporters adjusted their microphones, pens poised, every lens locked on his face. Then, without hesitation, he detonated. 8 years, the slowest recovery in history. He roared, his voice booming against the white columns like cannon fire. The words cracked across the courtyard, shaking the air. He jabbed his finger at the crowd of journalists, stabbing at them as though they were the enemy. His gestures were wild, expansive arms, slashing palms, pounding the podium with every phrase. Sweat glistened on his brow. His face flushed with fury, but he pressed forward, each shout louder than the last. Families were suffering. People were suffering. Obama left this country on its knees, and now he wants to lecture me about success. Please. Gasps and scribbles rippled through the press corps. Some reporters tried to interject, but Trump bulldozed through every question, steamrolling the air with his own momentum. The sound wasn't just loud, it was relentless, like a drumbeat in the ears of everyone watching at home. In living rooms across America, people leaned closer to their screens, riveted, whether in admiration or disbelief. Supporters clenched their fists and shouted along. Critics shook their heads, appalled, yet unable to look away. He paced behind the podium, arms swinging like a general commanding troops in the middle of battle. At one moment he pointed skyward, proclaiming his victory as destiny. The next he pounded the wooden surface as though he could break history itself by sheer force. The Rose Garden, once a symbol of diplomacy, was now an arena, his stage for fury. But the contrast was inescapable. Side by side, networks replayed Obama's calm words in one frame and Trump's tirade in another. One voice, soft, deliberate, cutting like a scalpel. The other, booming, erratic, landing like a hammer against glass. It was spectacle versus statesmanship, fire against restraint. And America was caught in the middle, torn between admiration for the performance and unease at the chaos it unleashed. As his rant surged to its peak, Trump leaned over the podium, squinting into the sea of cameras. His voice cracked with intensity, spittle flying, his fingers stabbing the air. I built the greatest economy the world has ever seen, and no one can take that away from me. The courtyard fell into a charged silence as he stepped back, chest heaving, the echo of his shout still vibrating against the stone. Reporters looked at one another, stunned, knowing they had just witnessed not a press conference, but an eruption. Across the country, living rooms and bars felt the same shockwave. The Rose Garden was supposed to project strength, dignity, control. Instead, it had become a spectacle of raw fury, and America was left to decide which voice carried more weight, the calm that cut deep or the storm that refused to be ignored. The Rose Garden fury didn't end in Washington. It spilled across the nation like wildfire carried by every glowing screen. Retirement homes, college dorms, greasy diners on forgotten highways, every television replayed the split screen that now defined the moment. On one side, Obama, calm and deliberate, words sharpened like a scalpel. On the other, Trump, red-faced, jabbing his finger, shouting into the void, as if volume alone could rewrite history. The contrast was jarring, impossible to unsee. In a retirement home in Florida, gray-haired veterans leaned forward in their wheelchairs, eyes narrowing at the loop on CNN. One man muttered, "I remember those bailouts. He saved my pension." Another barked back, "Yeah, but we didn't feel real recovery until Trump." The television cast its glow over wrinkled faces, etched with memory, splitting the room like a knife, half nodding in solemn agreement with Obama's tone, half cheering the defiance in Trump's roar. In a college dorm in Boston, students huddled around a laptop streaming the coverage. The room buzzed with nervous energy, voices overlapping like static. One boy laughed bitterly. "This is politics now, a lecture versus a tantrum." A girl shot back, eyes fierce. "At least he's fighting." People like that energy. The argument climbed higher, faster, until the screen itself seemed to fuel the fire, every replay of the split screen pushing them further apart. At a diner in Des Moines, coffee mugs trembled on counters as customers leaned in their conversations, cutting sharp. A truck driver slammed his fist down Obama's "too soft." "You need strength to lead." Across from him, a waitress snapped, "Strength isn't yelling. Strength is fixing what's broken." The television above the bar flickered with Trump's finger jabbing, and Obama's steady gaze, the sound competing with the hiss of the fryer, the clash of voices rising above the clatter of plates. The emotional crescendo rippled far beyond words. Families sat in silence, exhausted, staring at screens that felt more like mirrors reflecting their own division. Friends stopped calling each other back, afraid of one more fight. Strangers in bars muttered under their breath, afraid of sparking brawls. What should have been a debate over facts now felt like a war of perception, where truth itself seemed fragile. Brittle ones shout away from shattering. In living rooms, mothers turned down the volume, covering their children's ears, while fathers sat rigid, unable to tear their eyes away. The nation's pulse was quickened, but not by hope, by dread. The split screen wasn't just television, it was prophecy warning that America might never agree on what it had lived through. And as the broadcast repeated into the night, the question grew louder than the words themselves. When leaders shout louder, do we mistake volume for truth? It wasn't just politics anymore. It was personal. The split screen of calm against fury had leapt off the television and into American homes, turning quiet living rooms into battlegrounds. The same images replayed Obama's steady Trump, raging, and with every cycle, families felt themselves dragged deeper into the fight. The war of words was no longer on the screen. It was sitting at the dinner table. In Ohio, a teenage son stood in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, voice cracking with defiance. Trump's right. You guys were broke until he came in. His father shot up from the couch, veins rising in his neck, waving a stack of foreclosure letters he had kept buried in a drawer. Don't tell me what I lived, boy. I almost lost this house before that man ever showed up. The mother sat in silence between them, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white, the television light flickering across her face like fire. In Atlanta, a husband and wife sat on opposite ends of the couch, their bodies angled away from each other, the space between them colder than the winter night outside. He muttered at the screen, nodding at Trump's gestures, while she whispered back at Obama's replayed, "Line facts matter." Neither raised their voice, but the silence between them screamed loud enough to fill the room. The coffee table sat untouched, 2 mugs of tea cooling into nothing, the steam gone like the patience that had once bound them. In Phoenix, a grandmother tried to shush her grandchildren as they argued, their voices sharp, bouncing off the walls like ricocheting bullets. The older one shouted, "Trump gave people jobs." The younger slammed her fist into the couch cushion. "Obama stopped us from starving." The grandmother covered her ears, tears slipping down her cheeks, the weight of generations pressing in as she whispered, "Please, no more. Not in this house." But her words vanished into the storm, already tearing through the room. The pain was everywhere, families split by memory, by trauma, by the inability to agree on what had truly saved them. It wasn't about charts or numbers anymore. It was about fathers feeling erased, children convinced their parents were blind spouses, afraid that the person sitting beside them no longer understood who they were. Each argument carried the sting of betrayal, the wound of being told your suffering didn't matter. By nightfall, the glow of televisions cast the same battle across countless homes, shadows of anger stretching longer than the walls could hold. Dinner plates sat abandoned doors, slammed voices rose until throats ached. What was once background noise had become frontline combat, and no home felt safe from it. And in the silence that followed each fight, when tears had dried and screens still flickered, the truth was undeniable: families weren't just divided by politics. They were fractured by memory itself, and the pain of that fracture was tearing the nation from the inside out. The battle didn't stay confined to living rooms, it spilled into workplaces and classrooms, where the hum of daily life now carried the sharp edge of confrontation. In Phoenix, construction workers perched on steel beams, radios crackling with replayed sound bites of Obama's calm cadence and Trump's furious rant. Lunchboxes sat unopened as men shouted across the wind, their voices clashing like hammers on metal. One worker roared, "We didn't see paychecks grow till Trump showed up." Another fired back, "Without 2009, you wouldn't even have a job to keep." The argument rose over the clatter of machines, the worksite vibrating with more than drills and engines. It was vibrating with fury. Inside classrooms, the fight took a different form. Teachers caught between duty and division pulled up clips of both men freezing the frames on split screens, one calm, one enraged. In Boston, a history teacher stood at the front of her class, the glow of the projector washing across uneasy faces. "What do you notice?" she asked. A boy in the back muttered, "One looks like a teacher." A girl at the front whispered, The other looks like he's screaming at halftime. The room fell silent, students staring, realizing they weren't just analyzing rhetoric, they were being asked to choose what truth looked like. The confusion was heaviest among the young. In Philadelphia College, freshmen crowded around laptops scrolling through endless threads that contradicted each other. Charts flew one way, hashtags another, until facts blurred into opinion, and opinion hardened into rage. I don't know who to believe anymore. One student admitted rubbing his temples, exhaustion clear in his voice. His roommate shot back, "That's the point. If we can't tell, they both win." The conversation hung in the air like a warning, the kind that makes the future feel unsteady. Even grade schools weren't immune. In Houston, a fifth-grade teacher paused mid-lesson as her students argued, their small voices cutting through the classroom louder than any bell. "My mom says Obama saved our house," one shouted. Another child shook his head, repeating his father's words. "Trump built the economy back." The teacher, stunned, realized these weren't just playground arguments. They were echoes of dinner tables carried into her classroom like contraband. She pressed her hand to her forehead, whispering to herself, "How do I teach truth when truth itself is a debate?" Across the nation, workplaces and schools became unwilling arenas for the same war-tearing families apart. Radios blared, projectors glowed, voices cracked with the strain of defending not just politics, but identity. The emotional high surged as the youngest, those who hadn't even lived through the collapse, were forced to wrestle with its ghost. They weren't just confused, they were haunted, caught between narrative and memory, each day further blurring the line. And as the arguments echoed through scaffolds and chalk-dusted rooms, one realization pressed heavier than all the noise: the fight wasn't about the past anymore. It was about who would inherit the future, and whether truth itself would survive long enough to reach it. The shouting in homes, workplaces, and classrooms soon spilled onto the pages of America's newspapers. Editorial boards, desperate to make sense of the chaos, sharpened their words into weapons. The Wall Street Journal delivered a line that sliced through the noise. "History is not a baton race, it's a relay. Each leader hands something to the next, whether strong or fragile." Those words were reprinted, retweeted, repeated in classrooms and diners alike. Yet even they could not calm the storm. Instead, they reminded Americans of the terrifying truth that they weren't just fighting over politics. They were fighting over memory itself. In living rooms, readers circled the phrase with pens, pointing it out to their children as if underlining sacred scripture. "See, that's how it works." One father said, his voice steady but weary. His son, scrolling on his phone, shook his head, eyes locked on a thread declaring the opposite, that Trump alone had revived America. The tension wasn't in the facts anymore. It was in the rewriting of them, the erosion of memory that left families staring at each other like strangers. In coffee shops, strangers argued over folded newspapers, their voices cracking through the clink of cups. A man in a suit tapped the editorial with his finger, saying, "This proves Obama laid the foundation." Across from him, a woman snapped, "Proves nothing, papers spin just like politicians." The barista wiped the counter, pretending not to listen, but every word burrowed deep, reminding her that even silence had become a choice in a country drowning in competing versions of truth. The emotional climax came not with shouting, but with a chilling quiet. In classrooms, teachers found themselves asking students not about policies, but about the meaning of memory. If your parents lived one story, but your friends insist on another, which one do you trust? A boy raised his hand, slowly, his face pale. "I don't know anymore." The silence that followed was heavier than any debate, because it revealed what had been lost: certainty itself. By week's end, America felt unmoored. Newspapers stacked high at newsstands, hashtags looping endlessly, online televisions, blaring split screens, and still no agreement on what had truly happened. It wasn't numbers or charts that divided them. It was the fear that truth itself was fragile, and once reshaped, it might never return to its original form. At kitchen tables, people whispered the question aloud, afraid of the answer. If survival could be credited to one man instead of many, if suffering could be erased by volume alone, what else might be rewritten next? History was no longer the record of what they had lived. It was the prize in a war of voices, and no one could say which side would win. And as the nation stared into that unsettling reality, one question echoed louder than any headline, cutting through every whisper and every roar. If truth can be reshaped, what else can be rewritten? The shouting dulled, but the silence spoke volumes. After a week of screaming debates, looping hashtags, and split screens, flashing like gunfire, America's voice cracked into exhaustion. The war of words had not ended. It had simply burned itself out, leaving only smoke and a bitter aftertaste. What once rattled like thunder now lingered like ash. In suburban kitchens, couples sat across from one another, forks scraping against plates in uneasy rhythm. He scrolled his phone in silence. She sipped her wine without looking up, both too weary to reignite an argument that would only circle back to the same wound. Their living room still glowed with a muted television, but the sound was off, the silence heavier than any headline. Friends who once argued passionately now dodged the subject altogether. In coffee shops, conversations shifted to weather sports, anything but the question that hung between them like a blade. The fatigue was palpable, eyes glazed, shoulders slumped as though the nation itself had run a marathon it never signed up for. Even strangers avoided eye contact in public spaces, afraid that one glance might spark a debate. Neither side had the strength to fight. The emotional weight was undeniable. What had begun as fiery conviction had curdled into disillusionment, a heaviness that pressed down on families, classrooms, and workplaces alike. Truth no longer felt like something to defend. It felt like a burden too heavy to carry. And so the shouting stopped, replaced by a silence that wasn't peace but surrender. In that stillness, the nation waited, each person wondering in the quiet of their own home if this was the end of the fight or the calm before an even greater storm. In the quiet after the storm, whispers began to replace shouts. They didn't come from podiums or television anchors, but from small, unassuming places, corners of America, where the noise couldn't quite drown out memory. Obama's words, "Facts matter," slipped back into circulation, repeated softly like a hymn, a reminder that truth didn't need volume to survive. In a dim jazz club in New Orleans, a saxophone wailed over the crowd until a man at the bar leaned toward his neighbor. "You hear what he said? Facts matter." The phrase carried over the music, caught in the rhythm, lingering long after the final note faded. Heads nodded quietly in the smoke-hazed room. No argument, just recognition. In a small church in Alabama, the pastor paused mid-sermon and repeated the line, letting it echo off the walls like scripture. The congregation murmured back in agreement, their voices low but steady. For those who had endured the collapse, the words felt less like politics and more like testimony, a truth rooted in survival, too real to erase. In a classroom in Denver, a teacher wrote the phrase across the whiteboard in bold black marker. The students stared, restless, uncertain, until she said, "This isn't about sides. It's about remembering what we lived through." The room fell into a rare silence, the kind where even restless hands stopped tapping, because everyone felt the weight of the sentence. The endurance of those two words became its own defiance. While television pundits screamed and politicians sparred, ordinary people repeated the line in kitchens in prayer, circles, and text messages late at night. It was a whisper, yes, but one that refused to die, carrying the strength of memory into spaces untouched by spectacle. And in those unexpected places, the nation discovered that truth didn't always roar. Sometimes it endured in the quiet, steady voices of those who refused to forget. The whispers grew into gentle reminders, carried not by politicians, but by those who still believed memory mattered. Pastors told their congregations that truth was not measured by the loudest shout, but by the lives it touched. Parents at kitchen tables reminded their children that survival in 2008 had not been luck. It had been choices, sacrifices, and leadership that steadied a nation on the brink. Teachers under flickering fluorescent lights repeated the lesson, "With care, history belongs to those who remember honestly." In small towns and sprawling cities alike, these reminders became anchors in uncertain waters. A father unfolded yellowing mortgage letters to show his teenage son the proof of what had nearly been lost. A pastor repeated Obama's phrase, "Facts matter," until it lingered like a hymn in the air. A teacher in Detroit looked her students in the eye and said, "Noise fades, but memory stays." Don't ever forget who carried us through. The words didn't spark cheers, they sparked silence. And in that silence lay fragile hope. The emotional weight peaked not in fire, but in stillness. People realized that while shouting could fill a room, it could not outlast the quiet strength of lived experience. The noise would fade, the arguments would blur, but the memory of crisis, the scars, and the survival would endure. And for the first time in weeks, hope flickered. Maybe calm could outlast chaos. As communities leaned on these voices of remembrance, one question rose above the silence, fragile yet undeniable. What if the true legacy of leadership isn't victory, but memory? Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. 7. The Human Reckoning, 400 words. The story was never really about numbers. It was about integrity. When the shouting dulled and the hashtags faded, what lingered was not the statistics flashed on screens, but the quiet judgments of ordinary Americans. Uber drivers, veteran students, each carried their own version of truth, each forced to ask what leadership really meant. In New York, an Uber driver replayed the clips on his phone, between rides, shaking his head. One man screams for credit, he muttered, the other just lays out what happened. For him, leadership wasn't about claiming the victory lap, it was about who passengers trusted to steer them through chaos. His words were small, but they echoed the feelings of millions who were tired of noise and hungry for steadiness. In a VFW hall in Indiana, veterans debated between sips of coffee. One slammed his fist and growled that Trump had brought pride back. Another answered that Obama had brought stability when it mattered most. The arguments didn't settle anything, but the weight in the room was unmistakable. Trust wasn't measured in applause lines. It was measured in scars and the people who carried them. Students, too, felt the reckoning. In dorm rooms buzzing with late-night arguments, young voices asked not just who was right, but who could be trusted. If leadership is only about who yells loudest, then we're doomed, one girl whispered to her friends. They nodded uneasy, realizing they weren't just watching history, they were inheriting it. Across the country, a quiet consensus began to take shape. Leadership was not defined by the credit you seized, but by the trust you earned when the world was collapsing. And for a weary nation, that realization cut deeper than any statistic ever could. History, Americans began to realize, isn't written by shouting matches, it's written by the truths we choose to pass down. When the headlines faded and the debates dulled, what remained were the stories told in living rooms, around kitchen tables, and in the quiet spaces where generations met. It wasn't volume that carried history forward, but memory, sacrifice, and resilience woven into the voices of parents and grandparents. In Chicago, a father unfolded a box of old papers for his teenage daughter for closure. Notices, bank letters, mortgage adjustments. She frowned at the dates, at the red stamps, at the panic written in bold ink across pages that nearly cost them their home. This, he told her, tapping the fragile paper, is why we survived. Not because someone shouted loudest, but because choices were made to keep families like ours from losing everything. Her eyes lingered wide and sober, the lesson carving itself deeper than any classroom lecture ever could. In Houston, a mother stirred soup on the stove while her son asked why people fought so much over who saved the economy. She set the spoon down, turned, and told him about nights when the fridge was empty, about neighbors who lined up at food banks, about the relief that came in small but life-saving waves. We didn't care who got the credit, she said softly. We just cared that someone acted before we drowned. The boy nodded slowly, absorbing not just facts, but the weight of survival. In Michigan, a retired auto worker walked his grandson through the shuttered factory where he once spent his life. The machines sat silent now, rust creeping along their frames, but he pointed to the floor where they had restarted years earlier, after the bailout. This is where hope came back, he said, voice catching. The boy snapped a photo on his phone, not realizing he was capturing more than the steel and shadow. He was capturing a legacy. Across the country, these conversations rippled quietly, threading resilience through families who refused to let their struggles be erased. Teachers reminded students that history isn't a scoreboard, it's a relay of memory. Pastors reminded congregations that survival stories matter as much as scripture. Parents reminded children that sacrifice doesn't end with the generation that endured it, it becomes the foundation for the next. The emotional high came not from noise, but from stillness, from the recognition that America's legacy was not forged in shouting, but in survival. The crisis of 2008 was no longer just a chapter in textbooks. It was a scar carried by millions, handed down as a lesson in fragility and strength. And as families continued to tell those stories, one truth emerged with clarity. Leadership is remembered not for the credit it claimed, but for the lives it helped carry through the storm. History isn't shaped by the powerful alone, it's shaped by what people choose to remember. For weeks, America had been caught in the crossfire of noise of claims and counterclaims hurled like weapons across screens. But when the shouting dulled, what lingered were not the roars of politicians, but the fragile echoes of memory carried by ordinary people. It was in the quiet that truth revealed its weight. In a Kansas farmhouse, a grandmother told her grandchildren about the night she nearly lost the land her family had held for 3 generations and the relief that came just in time. In a Brooklyn apartment, a father whispered to his daughter about the layoffs that had almost broken him and the steady hand that gave him another chance. These weren't statistics, they weren't campaign lines, they were truths that lived and breathed, truths too precious to surrender to noise. The emotional crescendo swelled not from anger, but from recognition. Truth was fragile, but it was also alive. It pulsed in every scar, every folded letter, every story told around a dinner table. And in that fragility lay its worth, because something so easily broken demanded protection, demanded courage, demanded voices willing to defend it, even when silence felt easier. The screens would keep shouting, the politicians would keep spinning, but the choice would always belong to the people. Memory was their inheritance and integrity, their responsibility. And so the question hung heavy in the air, echoing across homes and hearts, asking not for applause, but for reflection. When the noise fades, will we choose to remember the truth or the story told the loudest? In life as in history, the loudest voices are not always the truest. What truly shapes our legacy is not the credit we claim, but the trust we earn and the memories we honor. Many of us have lived through hard times, moments when resilience, not rhetoric, carried us forward. The lesson is simple, yet profound facts matter. Integrity matters, and passing those values to the next generation is our greatest responsibility. When you tell your story, will you pass down the noise or the truth you lived through? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.